Good morning, everyone. I want to thank you for joining us for our first coffee talk. We are honored to have Professor Steve Horwitz from Ball State University. He is the Distinguished Professor of Free Enterprise there in the Department of Economics. He is also the director of the Institute for the Study of Political Economy in the Miller College of Business there at Ball State. For those of you who are unaware, Ball State is in Muncie, Indiana. I actually used to live in Indiana, and we have a Ball State alum who has joined us as well. If you see the right there, yep. Morgan Dean, thank you very much for showing up and chirping with Steve this morning. I appreciate that. I want to thank Steve for taking the time out of his schedule to join us for a Saturday. I also want to, before we get going into his remarks, I want to thank everybody for joining us on a Saturday morning and remind everyone, or actually announce to everyone, that on Saturday, April the 10th at 9 a.m., we will have our second coffee talk. And that will feature the former chair of the Libertarian National Committee, Nicholas Sarwark, who happens to be joining us today as well on video in a fabulous smoking jacket. So, Steve, without any further ado, I'll go ahead and turn things over to you.
All right, thank you, Brad. Thank you all for coming. Saturday morning, 9 o'clock, even via Zoom, is commitment, and I appreciate that. What I want to do this morning, I'm going to talk maybe about 20 minutes or so, and I'm going to keep it really informal. And I titled this sort of talk, or this series of observations, maybe might be a better term, A Libertarianism of Empathy. And a friend of mine likes to use that word, libertarian friend of mine, likes to use that word empathy a lot and sort of talk about how that as a kind of guiding principle for how he thinks about libertarianism is a helpful way to think about it. And it's a way, I think, to distinguish a certain style and content of libertarianism from the way libertarianism has often been presented, certainly in the 20th century, the second half of the 20th century, and I think even today. So I'm going to start maybe by drawing a few contrasts, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about what I think a libertarianism of empathy might look like. So what's the history, number one, but sort of also what it might look like and how it might change the way we think and we talk about and present ourselves to the rest of the world. I think the easiest way to get at the distinction I want to make between a libertarianism of empathy and the sort of way libertarianism is often presented is the difference between don't tread on me and don't tread on anyone, or don't tread on others is another way to put that, right? And there's a difference in emphasis there that I think matters. I think obviously if one is a libertarian, one believes in individual rights and one thinks that not treading on me is important. But the focus on the me there, I think, is often off-putting to other people, and it overrides or sort of makes us ignore the fact that what we're really saying is don't tread on anyone or on others or anyone else, right? That's the libertarian message. As much as it is leave me alone, it's don't harm others. And I think there's again a difference in emphasis there that really matters. I also think that the don't tread on me often gets misunderstood, and the sort of individualism that kind of goes with it gets misunderstood in an important way, right? People then sort of read you as saying your libertarianism is sort of hyper individualistic, or what the academics would say, we're atomistic individuals, we're all separate from each other, it's kind of that sort of, frontier mentality, right? That everyone has to survive on their own. And while, okay, that's not wrong. I mean, there's truth to that. But the reality of the world that I think libertarians want to live in, and certainly the world of a free market economy, is just the opposite. We're actually not alone. We're not by ourselves. We depend upon the cooperation and collaboration of millions, billions of other people every single day, right, through the market. I mean, if you are familiar with Leonard Read's iPencil story and those sorts of things, right, markets are about cooperation and collaboration. And we also, the other part of that, I think, is it overlooks the ways in which we collaborate and cooperate with each other in civil society. One of the problems, and this is not something I have in my remarks at any great extent, but we can talk about. One of the problems I think libertarians have had historically is we've divided everything into free markets, and government over here. And there's this whole other set of stuff in the middle that's really, really important, like churches and synagogues and mosques, like other kinds of friendly societies, all the pieces of civil society, all the ways in which we attempt to solve our problems through non-market, but also non-state processes. If you've read any de Tocqueville, Democracy in America, what he called the associations, right, are an important part of a free society. And I think libertarians have, until recently, the last 10, maybe 20 years, have really not talked about those very much. And so historically, again, at least in the last, since the mid 20th century, this language of rights and my freedoms and sort of all this way of talking has been the way libertarianism has evolved. And I think that's understandable in the period we're talking about for a couple of reasons. Certainly one of them is that libertarianism and classical liberalism a little bit more broadly grew up in opposition to real world socialism. And so the sort of emphasis on the individual, the emphasis on individual rights in a world where it seemed like everybody thought the state or the collective was the way to go. And certainly the world in the United States in the 1930s and 40s and 50s was not hospitable to libertarian ideas. And so sort of pushing back against that collectivism with a kind of strong individualism was understandable. And the two people who we can point to as sort of creating that intellectual framework for us, of course, are Ayn Rand and Murray Rothbard. And for both of them, that sort of the strong defense of individual rights, that strong defense of the individual, particularly in Rand, right, sort of gave us the kind of aesthetic, the rhetoric of the way in which we talk about liberty. But I think there's a whole other tradition that's important to recognize and understand that has argued for liberty, for libertarian ideas, not by emphasizing sort of individual rights or the kind of approach that we see in Rand and Rothbard, but rather has emphasized the good consequences that come from people being free and the bad consequences that come when government steps in. And interestingly, right, the two most important names for me in this, let's say three actually important names for me in that tradition: Mises, Hayek, and Milton Friedman, right? Those are the, I mean, again, all economists, right? Not so perhaps not surprising. I would think they're especially cool, but I think it's important to understand that the way that those guys argued for classical liberal ideas was not rights, right? You will not find the phrase natural rights, for example, in Hayek or in Friedman. You'll find it in Mises only as an object of criticism. And that's a really different way. What for them, it's a really different way of thinking about why classical liberalism. Mises in particular, I think, is really interesting because he talks about the ways in which leaving people free generates, and this is his phrase, social cooperation. That the only way that we can function as a society, the only way that we can cooperate and collaborate and get an extensive division of labor and get progress and prosperity is by leaving people free in the way that libertarianism asks of us. So it's not a rights argument, right? And it's an argument that says freedom works, and here are the good consequences that come from freedom. And I think that that's important to understand historically too. There's, again, the Cold War and socialism led to what's now called the fusionism of libertarianism and conservatism, as both were anti-socialist, anti-communist. And again, I think that's understandable in the context of the 20th century. But you have to understand, if you go back farther, classical liberalism, libertarianism was progressivism. It was the progressive belief system in the 19th century. It was the left of the 19th century. We were the woke folks in the 19th century, and that I think is important to remember. So I'm going to kind of run a little list here of some accomplishments of that 19th century libertarian movement and the ideas there, and sort of what's happened since, to sort of think about the ways in which historically we libertarians have been the woke folks, have been the ones who have sort of demonstrated the good consequences that come from freedom, and in particular why that those good consequences were especially the case for the least well off among us, and the ways in which classical liberalism has expanded opportunity, expanded the range of human beings who were able to come within that world of freedom. Perhaps the most important is that liberalism, broadly speaking, supplanted feudalism and monarchies, right? I mean, democracy among libertarians, democracy gets a bad rap sometimes, and deservedly so for many of its excesses. But it's also important to understand, and I think we understand this much better today than we did 6 months ago, that one of the most important parts about democracy from a libertarian perspective is that it enables the peaceful transition of power. Whether you're an anarchist or a minarchist or wherever you sit on that debate, okay, ensuring that political power in the real world we exist in transfers peacefully seems to me to be really, really important. You can't, whatever degrees, whatever freedom we have today is going to be less so if every election is accompanied by riots at the Capitol, for example, right? So there is, I mean, and Mises talks about this as well. He points out that, look, democracy is just a tool. It's a tool for the peaceful transition of power. The mistake, of course, that we collectively have made is the sort of idea of unlimited democracy, of raising democracy above our concerns about things like constitutional rights and so forth. But in so the problem, of course, I mean, I don't have to tell a group of libertarians this, but the problem, of course, is the scope of power that we give to government, not so much that it's democracy per se. And so what we really need to be thinking about is how do we constrain democracy, right? How do we, one might say, how do we put democracy in chains? But that would lead us to a whole other discussion of the book that I don't want to talk about. So one of the victories of liberalism historically was overthrowing the feudalism and monarchies. It's also the case that 19th century and 18th century, for that matter, classical liberalism opposed militarism and imperialism. If you read Adam Smith was really great about sort of imperialism and colonialism and all that kind of stuff, and recognizing the mistakes that were being made at the very time that he was writing. You go later into the 19th century, people like Herbert Spencer, another guy who gets a bad rap from critics of libertarianism. Spencer was an anti-imperialist and an anti-militarist in really important ways. So there's this sort of tradition of concern about peace, both in democracy as a peaceful transition of power, but also opposition to the ways in which the state used military power to conquer other folks. The other thing, of course, about classical liberalism, libertarianism, is that in the 19th century, it promised equality and it slowly delivered it. We can go back to the debates between John Stuart Mill and the Romantics over slavery, and Mill, of course, was on the good side of that issue and a staunch opponent of slavery and of what was happening in Jamaica. For those of you who don't know the story, I didn't have this in my notes, but I might as well tell it. Economics is often called the dismal science, and the assumption people have is that the name dismal science comes from either one of two places. One, either we're always the depressing people at the party saying, no, you can't do that, no, you can't do that, which is true. But the more common belief is that it comes from sort of Malthus and sort of limited resources, and the idea that we sort of can't do everything we might want to do. And so again, we're sort of always the ones saying, no, you can't do that. In fact, that's not where dismal science comes from. Dismal science was pinned on Mill and the other 19th century classical liberal economists because of their opposition to slavery. It was coined by a guy named Thomas Ruskin, who argued, and again, Ruskin was like the romantic writers, sort of, of the sort of the precursors to the modern left in some ways. But these guys argued that racial hierarchies were a good thing. They enabled people to understand their place in society, and that this status was important. And they were sort of longing for a pass to this. And they were upset at the libertarian and the classical liberal economists for arguing that race didn't matter or shouldn't matter, right? And that everyone's money was the same, and that in the marketplace we would undermine all those racial hierarchies. They didn't like that. They recognized the argument, but didn't like it. And economics was dismal because it had this picture of a future where we were all sort of equal, and all these hierarchies and status that sort of defined society were gone. And to the romantics, that was a dismal picture of the future. So when people call economics a dismal science, I wear it as a badge of honor, because it's a reflection of the fact that we were on the right side of the issues of slavery and racism in the 19th century. And of course, the other issue that John Stuart Mill and others are known for in the 19th century was women's rights. Mill and Harriet Taylor, going back to the 18th century, Wollstonecraft, all of these folks were in the classical liberal tradition, arguing for what we would now call gender equality, and arguing for women's rights. And we certainly saw in the 19th century the forces of capitalism and liberalism break down many of the barriers to women's equality in society. By the end of the 19th century, married women were able to own property and sign contracts, which they couldn't do in the English-speaking world before that. And again, say what you want, but the acquisition of the vote nationwide in the early 20th century, as well as a kind of, we can walk through the 20th century accomplishments of, in terms of women's equality. But don't forget, one of the most important of those was the fact that capitalism, the market economy, created a level of wealth that enabled women to have degrees of freedom that they didn't have before, and enabled women to, for example, get out of bad marriages, and it got women in working place, offered them job opportunities that made them financially independent. And capitalism brought the technology that began to free women from the home. I often ask my classes what they think. I taught a course on the economics of gender and family, and I'll ask them, what was more important to women's sort of long-term well-being, getting the vote or the invention of the washing machine? And that's, if you know what life was like before washing machines, when doing the family laundry was a multiple day affair, and was so involved that often girls were forced to stay home from school to help do the laundry because it took so long. If you're interested in that kind of stuff, if you've ever seen Hans Rosling's TED Talk called The Magic Washing Machine, if you haven't seen that, you should Google The Magic Washing Machine. It's the greatest 9-minute TED Talk ever. And sort of get a sense for how important the washing machine is. The other issue, of course, is that libertarians, classical liberals, were out in front of the gay rights and same-sex marriage issue in ways that I think have not been fully appreciated and recognized. Once again, the sort of wealth created by capitalism made it possible, in ways I'm happy to talk more about, for people to live out as gays and lesbians, and also change the nature of heterosexual marriage in ways that made the demand for same-sex marriage possible. But more narrowly, the Libertarian Party has had a gay rights platform since the mid-70s, and was talking about same-sex marriage from about the same time, maybe not long after. And that, I think, it's, I don't have to tell with Nick here, I certainly don't have to say this too often, but it is an important point, I think, for libertarians to stress. And I think the LP has done a pretty good job in sort of reminding people that hey, this was our issue before it became everyone else's. But I think it's part of a broader narrative, right, that says, hey, this is, classical liberalism, libertarianism has always been concerned with the rights of minorities and the rights and extending rights to more and more groups. The other thing about 19th century classical liberalism is it promised progress, and it delivered it. And again, I can talk about sort of more data later, but it delivered it especially for the least well off, and not just sort of over 150 years. We live better today, and sort of poor and average Americans live better today than we did in the 1990s or in the 1970s. Right? Everyone talks about how things are so much worse since the 1970s. I was alive in the 1970s. I wasn't old, but I was alive, right? No, things are much better today, and we can bring out the data to show that, and we can talk about the ways in which markets make that possible. Now, of course, it's always challenging to have those conversations when we live in a mixed economy. But I think there's ways that we can talk about that progress, and certainly we can talk about progress over the course of 100 or 150 years or 200 years in ways that are clearly related to the advent of markets and capitalism and the way in which they have enabled us to become better off. One of those is what I like to call the McCloskey calculation from Deirdre McCloskey, the economic historian. In one of her books in her Bourgeois Virtues trilogy, which are also a great read, though not short, she has this calculation that sort of tries to get at how much better off humanity is today than 200 years ago. And what she argues is there's three things happening. There's more people than there were 200 years ago. Those people are living longer than they did, and they're living better than they did 200 years ago. And so, I'm going to go through this math kind of quickly, but she says, for example, on average, people can consume 8.5 times the goods and services they did 200 years ago. Okay, so figure 8.5 times. All right, people are living longer. If you make it to 16 years old today, you're going to live twice as long as you did making it to 16 years old 200 years ago. Okay. By the way, if you start at 0 and say from birth, that number is much bigger than 2. But if we go sort of adult years, right? People live twice as long and have twice the number of adult years now than they did 2 years ago. And of course, there's more people. right? And 200 years ago, there was about 1 billion. Now there's 7.5, maybe 8 billion. I'm going to stay with 7 to keep the number conservative. That's the number she used from her books a few years ago. So if you do that math, if you go 8.5 times 2 times 7, it multiplies out to 119. And what that, one way of thinking about that is we are 119 times better off. Humanity is 119 times better off in terms of quality, number of quality life years lived than we were 200 years ago. That's not 119%. That's 119 times better off. That's massive, right? That's just huge. And what McCloskey argues is what we conventionally call the Industrial Revolution. Capitalism, her term sometimes these days, is trade-tested betterment. Explain that we're so much better off because of the freedoms, the economic freedoms, but also the political and social freedoms that classical liberalism has given us. And I don't think we talk enough as libertarians about how the ideas we support have delivered on all of those promises, the promises of equality, right? The promises of progress, how we were essential in undermining feudalism and monarchy and challenging militarism and so forth. That we've done that. Our ideas have done that. And I think we get defensive sometimes and are put on the defensive because people's interpretation, of course, certain people in the 20th century's interpretation of markets and capitalism is heavily affected by crises like the Great Depression, right? Capitalism must be bad. Well, look at the Great Depression, or pick your favorite. Look at COVID, look at the financial crisis, and we can talk about how one might respond to those arguments. So I'll finish by sort of suggesting that what all this to me means that our rhetoric and our priorities could be really different, right? I want to imagine a libertarianism that really focused and talked about first the ways in which state interventions harm women and people of color and the poor. I think that's a better approach for us to talk about and present ourselves than foregrounding things like the Fed or tax cuts or the culture war. Again, not that any of those aren't well, culture war maybe not, but the Fed and tax cuts are important. I spent my sort of professional career as a critic of the Fed and wanting to see the Fed go away. But I'm not sure that's the best issue to put in front if the idea is to expand our audience and to present a libertarianism of empathy, right? We want to talk about the ways in which government policies have harmed those groups, and conversely, we want to talk about the ways in which markets can resolve those problems, and markets have helped those groups historically. Imagine, for example, that we talked about free immigration and the way it benefits not only Americans, which it does, but also the immigrants, right? Oftentimes, even when libertarians, there's debates about immigration these days. Shouldn't be, but there are, right? But even when libertarians are good and sort of arguing for more immigration, for free immigration, oftentimes the focus is on what it does for us as Americans, which is fine and true. But I also think it's important to understand what it does for the immigrants. And a libertarianism that understood that the best thing we could do for the rest of the world is to open up free trade and to open up to more immigration. That kind of libertarianism, one that emphasized that, I think would be extremely valuable and more persuasive to more people. And imagine too, if we were in fact more consistently anti-war and anti-imperialist, and again, remembered that people of color and poor folks in the rest of the world count too, right? It's one thing to say, well, we're spending all our money on sort of military and the other, but it's also important to emphasize that we are blowing up poor people. That's what it does. And recognizing the importance of that as the foot we put forward, I think is really important. So in the end, what I'm arguing for here is not a change in beliefs or in principles. There are, my bleeding heart libertarian friends, there are some who really want to, I think, argue in a somewhat more radical way about those underlying principles. But for me, I'm an old school, in many ways, an old school 70s and 80s libertarian. That's where I grew up. And that's where I learned all this stuff. But I think that what I am arguing for is that the way we talk about things, the way we present the things, the way we choose to highlight and prioritize certain things, the rhetoric we use really, really matters. And it's going to matter more in a world where young people are coming through an education system where they're being exposed to over and over again these issues about those who've been historically marginalized. That's the way they view the world. And it leads to the crazy excesses that we see on college campuses. But put that aside for a minute. The reality is those are the young people who we have to appeal to if we want to bring more people into this movement. And so we're going to have to find a way to speak their language. And I think part of speaking their language is to show the ways in which libertarian ideas can address the issues that they're concerned about and address the things that concern them. We're not going to have the same answers, and they might not like all of our answers, but I think it's important for us to use all kinds of virus metaphors these days to inoculate ourselves against the charge that we don't care about those things. We don't care about those issues. We don't care about marginalized people. And sort of putting that forward is really, really important. And I'm happy to talk about sort of other kinds of policies where traditional libertarian concerns actually have a way of being packaged and talked about or focused on in a way that I think can address those considerations. So let me stop there and leave plenty of time for questions. Thank you all.
Professor Horwitz, before we get started on questions, I want to thank you once again, for taking the time to join us on a Saturday morning for the very first of our coffee talks. I'm going to go ahead and, since I have the floor, go ahead and ask the first question. If you had one particular issue that you would focus on, or that you would like to see a focus of libertarian messaging built around, that would probably bring us our largest gains, what would you say that is, especially on a college campus where you have direct experience?
Well, yeah, I think there's going to be two answers there. I think on college campuses, issues around criminal justice reform and the police and race are the way to go. I mean, we have the greatest asset in the world, by the way, Radley Balco, who I don't think he would call himself a libertarian these days. Doesn't matter. I mean, he's been around the libertarian movement, for a long time, and there were people like me who knew his work 10, 15 years ago before he became a really big deal. But Radley's work is incredible, right? And there's not, and libertarians have been talking about this issue again for at least a decade, if not more. It's like in Die Hard when McClane says, "Welcome to the party," right? That's kind of where we've been at this party for a long time. So I think on college campuses, that constellation of issues around criminal justice reform, I think, and frankly, probably marijuana legalization too fits into that, right? That whole set of issues, which I think can also be tied into libertarians. We should be comfortable talking about structural racism and using that phrase, because the problem from a libertarian perspective isn't that there's bad people making bad decisions. The problem is that we've got a whole bunch of institutions and structures and laws that lead even good people to do bad things, right? And so I think, we don't necessarily agree with our friends on the left about exactly what the relevant institutions and structures are, but we can have that conversation if we demonstrate, one, that we recognize that racism is a real problem, and that secondly, it's built into institutions in important ways. We just disagree what the institutions might be. So I think those kind of conversations on college campuses are important, and I think it's a good thing. One of the things that excited me when Students for Liberty was created is their willingness to have dialogue with the left and sort of find those issues. And I think the LP can do that in ways too, in terms of, if there's chapters or ways you want to appeal on college campuses. I think those issues are probably the ones that really, where we have the most overlap and that do fire up students. I mean, again, I think the sort of gender and sexuality issues too. But the interesting thing about those, I think, is that many of those issues are sort of now cultural ones as opposed to legal ones. Those sort of trans bathroom issues are in play. But again, I think it's a matter of our rhetoric oftentimes here too, right? If you spend time on Facebook or Twitter, that there's this sort of transphobic, anti-trans corner of libertarianism that's doing us no good. in making ourselves, making young people open to what the message we have to bring them, because those issues aren't going to go away. I mean, I've got 2 adult kids in their 20s and 2 stepkids in their teens, and that's remains really, really central issues for them too. So, but there, I think it's not as often a policy question as it is a question of empathy, right? A question of how do we talk and how do we recognize the legit concerns people have. For a broader, off the college campus, messaging question, I think there's a way to generate a broad appeal that overlaps people's opposition on the right to economic regulation and people's concern on the left about the well-being of the least well-off. I've written a few things about the regressive effects of regulation, the way in which economic regulations, like occupational licensing and zoning laws, and limits on Uber and all this kind of stuff. The impact of those laws is distinctly and primarily on poor folks and oftentimes folks of color. And sort of talking about that is a way that we can sort of bring people from both sides. I know you're like free markets, fine. Join us in opposing these regulations. And by the way, one of the reasons, if not the most important reason you should oppose them, is look at the harm, look who's harmed by them, right? And sort of, dragging our friends on the right in to sort of say, it's okay to care about those folks, and sort of on the left to say, if you care about those folks, you should consider these. I think it's underplayed was the fact that the Obama administration toward the end issued a really great report on the problems of occupational licensing. Right. And so there's something there to say, even the Obama administration understood that this was a bad policy. So I think those issues are valuable ones. Off the top of my head, that's, I think, I tend to look for issues where we can draw from both sides, right? And that seems to me to be the most obvious one to me. Again, I'm probably thinking mostly like an economist here, but that seems to me to be a really good set of issues for us to be talking about. Yes, and my wife, who's listening over my shoulder, also mentions that we can have the same kind of analysis for gender as well, right? Where we can talk about the way in which the tax code is biased against female secondary earners, and that we need to have a true the problem of joint filing, and we need to be able to let married couples file separately in ways that would make the playing field more equal for women, for mostly women who are secondary earners in their decision to go to work. Tax code penalizes them heavily right now, and that was an intentional policy in the 1940s and 50s to keep women at home. So we can talk, that's another kind of way we can talk about tax reform. People on the right like that topic, and we can talk about the way in which the current tax code is biased against women and undermines the ability of women, particularly women with kids, to work. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. I appreciate it. If there's anybody else, go ahead and open the floor to anybody else with questions. Feel free to unmute and ask away. And if we don't have questions, then we can just kind of move into sipping our coffee and chatting with each other for as long as we'd like. Laura, I think.
Good morning. Yes, I have a question.
Sure.
So my name is Laura Hartman, and just my question's related to soft skills. So I heard you talking about empathy and being able to focus on that common ground. And in doing so, facing outwards, not necessarily facing within the party itself or facing other libertarians, but facing outwards in the community and outreach. In a purple state, specifically in a purple county, what are some strategies or some tools, if you will, that have been helpful to you in your experience to show compassion, active listening, and empathy while we're reaching out?
Show all of those things, right? I mean, I think just have them is the first step, right? I think to actually, I think one of the things that we can do, I love the active listening part, because I think sometimes we libertarians we like to argue, and we're used to arguing, and we're used to wanting to win debate points. And I think that under entering conversations like that, looking for debate points, often undermines real conversation. And I think to sort of get away from the debate points mentality and to think, okay, how do I understand where this person's coming from? And can I put myself in that person's shoes and see where, see why they would have the views that they have? And then to sort of process that and sort of think about, how do I respond to this person in this context, having heard what they're saying? And I think too often, we have that sort of mental Rolodex, that mental set of file folders about canned responses when someone brings up a topic, and we hear the magic word and our brain goes, oh, I know what the response is, right? The platform plank is, right? For that's how we all do it. And, yeah, right. That's the college dorm room version of it, right? You boom, boom. And, but I think it's more, I think you have to get yourself to stop for a second, right? And pause and say, okay, what am I really hearing here? I also think you have to know part of that is picking your battles, okay? Is you're not going to change everyone into an anarcho-capitalist in one dinner conversation. And if you do, they're going to go right back to the next person who talks to them, right? I think you just have to decide what's the most important thing I heard here, or what's the most fundamental thing, or what's the thing I think I can make some progress on and get some understanding with. Because none of us became libertarians in one dinner, right? It was over a period of time where we were exposed to ideas slowly but surely. We read a book and another book. So don't bite off more than you can chew. I think one thing at a time, and thinking very carefully about who the audience is. If you're presenting to the Rotary Club, it's different than presenting to the local marijuana legalization group, right? So thinking about audience and thinking about what are the things I want to talk about here. And be willing to ignore things, right? This is a lesson I learned with my 27 years at a liberal arts college, and all of my friends in the faculty, right, were progressive lefty types, and I love them, and they're still my friends to this day. But when we would talk about stuff, the hardest part for me was not wanting to respond to every single thing and say no this, no this. Just okay, just let it go, right? It's okay, and just figure out the ones that I think that you need to respond to, and just coming across as being a person who is empathetic, who really does care about the concerns that folks you're talking to have, and about how libertarian ideas might address them. Sometimes you go into debate mode, okay, that's fine, or you can be a little glib. I also think Milton Friedman is the best at this, right? Milton Friedman was the best at this, and one of the reasons was, if you watch video of Milton, he always had a smile on his face. He was the happiest guy in the world. And sometimes it's, you'll think, oh, that's a bit of a smug smile because he knows he has the answer, right? And he's okay. But even so, he was always smiling. He was always happy. He was never mean, right? Never mean, never cutting, never disrespected questioners, right? And never, so finding ways to be a happy warrior, in quotes, right? Finding ways to make libertarianism seem both humane and fun, I think, are important too. I don't know. I mean, I'm not a communications expert. I'm only a guy who's done it a lot for now 41 years in the libertarian movement. But it just seems to me that it's a lot about self-presentation, about how we come across and how we listen. I think the listening part is really, really important.
Thank you, Laura. I appreciate you having a question. I have one that was sent to me by somebody who wanted to kind of remain quiet, but how do libertarians overcome today's censorship on social media with as hard of a time as they've had getting traction as an alternative to the regular way of thinking, the binary Democrat versus Republican? In today's climate, it may be harder. So how can they overcome that?
Don't say stupid racist shit. I mean, right? It's a glib answer, but it's not wrong either, right? And so I'll put it the less glib way, which is, I don't know anyone who's been booted from Facebook or Twitter for arguing for deregulation or school choice or any of a million other issues we can think of. The reason libertarian voices, for the most, there's some exceptions, but for the most part, the reason libertarian voices and I'm going to put libertarian air quotes here, I get booted is because people say dumb, racist, whatever, stuff, and don't, right? This is part of our issue of self-presentation. And the hardest thing, right, for me is I've been a libertarian since I was 16, right? So this is a long 41 years, right? It's a long time. And sort of what economists would call the negative externalities associated with other people who use the word libertarianism has been an ongoing problem, right, for that period. And you can't, I can't like make only the people I want use that label. So it's always going to be a problem. But I think I can't think of, with the exception of a small group of sort of more radical anarchist libertarians who Facebook, I think, booted out their pages, not necessarily them personally, but their pages in a kind of sweep where the word anarchist got everybody caught up, and that's wrong and unfortunate. But the individuals, as far as I know, most of them are back on Facebook anyway. So again, I think that's one exception, and that's a real problem. But for the most part, right, the people who've been targeted have been people, if you're passing around memes, right? I mean, come on, right? So if we actually think about how we present ourselves and are careful about it, I don't think we'll have a problem. Okay. I can't think of a libertarian academic, for example, and we say crazy things on social media, but I can't think of any who've been silenced by. I've never. I mean, those of you who might follow my Facebook page, it's not like I'm quiet, right? But I've never been zucked. I've never even had really a warning. I'm going to think maybe once for anything I've ever posted, and that if what I'm thinking of was sort of not even about libertarian stuff. So again, I think part of the answer is we need to behave ourselves, right? And if you really want a free for all where you can say and do whatever you want, then you're going to have to find other platforms. But I think that's going to be increasingly difficult. I don't think libertarians' biggest complaints and biggest issue should be that social media companies don't like it when we say racist stuff, right? No, right? That's not really the sort of major thing we should be focused on. We should be, again, actively, I don't like the term anti-racist because it has all the connotations to it, but actively demonstrating our bona fides, right? Actively demonstrating the ways in which libertarian ideas are an antidote to racism and racial inequities, not a facilitator of it. I saw Nick's hand earlier. I saw it again.
Thank you, Brett. I don't like to talk without permission. It's a habit I cultivated from being on the other side. Professor Horwitz, I want to ask you what is perhaps a difficult question, if that's okay with you.
It certainly is. And now my mental Rolodex is going, which difficult question is this going to be?
So there's a structural problem I've observed in American politics for a while now of solution aversion, where people choose a thing to be angry about that is not changeable within the near term. And that's by design, because if you are angry about something you can't change, you get the emotional valence of hatred without the obligation for work, which is a much more comfortable place to be in our attention economy, consumer kind of culture that we're in, where there's just more things to do than we have time to do, and people have stopped creating and just consume. And the hate is both consuming and consumer of people and time and good work. There is a pattern of solution aversion I've seen within the broader libertarian movement, where it is popular for people to list the problems with the Libertarian Party, the political arm of the libertarian movement, and talk about what terrible people are doing within it, what mistakes are being made with it. And there is a pattern where those people also tend to not engage in any of the work of building or being an example within the institution, preferring instead to complain that I will not join until that bad person is not allowed to use the label, which appears to me to be the same solution averse instinct, because the idea that you can change the behavior of, let us take, for example, an angry podcaster who says hateful, racist things. I'm not sure if there are any real examples, but it's a hypothetical of mine. People like yourself or others may say, well, that person is associated with the party, so now I will not associate with the party. And so they're complaining about a problem that they show no revealed preference for fixing. How do we solve that problem, Professor Horwitz?
Well, so, I as I said in the other answer, I think railing against other people's use of the word libertarian to describe themselves is pointless, because we can't, as you say, we can't control them. We can't change them. All right. But, I think the more, the more that the LP presents itself, its institutional self, right, as empathetic and all the things that I've been talking about today, I think that is one way to pull the critics perhaps back in. I mean, some of them are just bomb throwers, right? That they just would rather toss the bombs than do the work. But I do think there's others for whom they would do work within the institution if they thought, right, that the institution's identity as an institution, the party's identity as a party, was one that clearly indicated where it stood vis-a-vis hypothetical talk show hosts who say racist things, right? That's not a criticism of what the party has actually done, but I think that's, and it may be that the standards that critics hold are too high. That's another problem here too, which is part of the solution aversion, right? Which is to say, if I'm only willing to accept a party that's 98% pure by my definition, then okay, we're never going to get there. All right, but I would go ahead.
Which group are you in?
Oh, I'm certainly not in the 98% pure group, right? I don't think it needs to be 98% pure, and I do think the party's done over the last 10 years has tried hard to sort of establish its institutional identity in ways that indicate it's not willing to sort of put up with the kind of nonsense we see from some quarters. And I think to the extent that I followed the battles of the last couple of years, right, it seems like the forces of good have largely won the sort of internal political battle, but the forces of evil continue to be present. And I think that the tension that's still ongoing between how do we have a broad tent party, but also a party that is one that sticks to good principles. When you have a structure that allows folks to come in and sort of bring their own perception of what libertarianism is to the table, which I think is a good thing, right? This is a risk that you have to take. For me, it's I don't think you need to be 98% pure to have a good libertarian party that can support. I mean, I voted for both of the last two candidates happily, and I'm not, my own views is I'm a short run gradualist and a long run radical, right? That I want a radically different world down the road, but you cannot get there in one step. And I think you have to, again, sort of figure out where the winnable political battles are, and find the ways in which, as you say, the things we can actually change and the things we can actually do, which is why I think the economic regulation stuff is important. That's a doable thing. And interestingly, a lot of those regulations, for example, are at the state level. And so I think, we often get wrapped up in national politics in a way, but certainly the party's success has been much greater at the local and state level, and both in terms of elected officials, but also in terms of change, right? And so I think that finding ways to build up, county level and state level parties are important too, and getting involved in that level often maybe even more effective. But yeah, it doesn't have to be pure, it just has to be clear on what the message is. I'm gonna, is in when Brett asked me to do this, I was like, uh-oh, Florida LP, uh-oh, right? Because I know, right? But you know, all right.
That gets to my point, and maybe I'm not making it sharply enough, but I'll sharpen it. As long as good people like yourself don't come to the table, only the bad people show up at the table. And I have spent 2 decades of being the good person who doesn't seed the field, who sticks with voice and doesn't do exit and doesn't do loyalty. But a lot of other people talk about it and, you know, oftentimes throw the bombs at the wrong people. You know, they throw the bombs at the people doing the work for, you didn't do the work good enough for me. That's why I'm not going to help. And so it's not that it's, I want to fix that problem, right? This is not from the personal is what animates how strongly I feel about it, but I'm not focused on my personal feelings about the history. I'm focused on how do I make it so that people that follow us don't have to tread the same path.
Yeah.
And are you the sort of person who's going to help, or are you the sort of person who's going to point and say, that's what you guys should do with your time?
Well, I'm here, right?
That's good. I like that.
Right. And you know, I mean, my life is busy and complicated, and I have to choose my battles carefully too, right? And you know, as we'll leave it at that. And as a man, I mean, I'll say it with all of you guys here. I'm always sort of willing to speak and be involved with LP events on the state or local or national level. All you guys have to do is ask. If I can, assuming travel and my health permits, right? All you have to do is ask. And in the world of Zoom, you know, whatever. I'm happy I love doing stuff like this. I had fun at the Illinois LP a number of years ago at their state convention. I did a talk to and some others. So I love doing that. And you know, I don't have the time and the energy to be deeply involved. And I will always be someone who I hope, you know, raises valid criticisms when they're appropriate. But the type you identify, right? The solution averse sort of, I've got all these criticisms, but I don't want to help, is real. And by the way, it's a known type.
It's everywhere.
What?
Yeah, it's everywhere.
It's everywhere. It's a known type among faculty, right? I can think of a million faculty colleagues who are exactly that too. You know, and I think some of it is people who just don't ever want to do the work, right? They just don't ever want to do it. But I think there are people who you know, who would be more involved if they were, you know, I think part of it is getting them to hold a reasonable threshold of what counts as good enough, right? Mm-hmm. You can't be, I'm not a purist.
We have a couple more questions. Laura, since you already asked one, is it all right if I go with the other two before? Okay. The next one that I saw was Jasmine. Go ahead and ask your question, Jasmine. I'll go ahead and lower the hand here.
Hey, can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Yeah.
Awesome. Good to see you guys. Professor, I do have a question. This one's about media representation. What is the best course of action, I guess, to kind of try to increase our representation in the media? I've noticed the last couple of years, especially this last election cycle, for example, where like Joe Jorgensen had almost no representation in the media. And it seems to be like a thing where only the main 2 political parties have representation. So we're kind of like the forgotten about party, which to me, it seems like that kind of makes it harder for us to be a little bit more known and have people know more about us.
Yeah, I wish I had a good answer to this question. I can think of it.
I actually do.
Brett, I'm going to just say 1 or 2 quick things now, Brett. I think, you know, we don't want media coverage for people dancing in their underwear at the right. I mean, that's, you know, part of it is there's media coverage and there's media coverage. I do think it's, you know, I think, and I don't think we want media. I think with candidates, we don't want media coverage for saying sort of outrageous for the sake of outrageous things, right? I think you just got to keep finding your way into issues and particularly finding your way on issues where we have something to say that the other 2 parties don't. And I think using connections to find reporters and find folks who have some sympathy and who would hear a story like that and want to try to push it out. I'm not a media guy, so that's about the best I can do, but Brett may have more. Definitely.
I do actually. One of the things that I found that works pretty well is when you're actually doing things that are noteworthy and you let the media know about them through your existing relationships, you get a lot more coverage than if you just expect them to find out what you're talking about. You're able to give a real world example of what you're doing for the problem, and you're also showing your involvement in the community. That's one of the big things that we talked about outside of this, where we've talked about how to be taken seriously. You actually have to be doing something, and you have to build relationships with people that are outside the party to have people outside the party listen to what's happening inside the party.
And I would just add, I think you can get that again at the local and state level, oftentimes in ways that you're just not at the national level. My view has always been that the long run strategy for the LP has to involve building up like a baseball team, building up a farm team. You got to have people at the local level who are doing the work and getting elected and working on local policy in ways that give them skills and reputation, and that the media begin to know. And then when they decide to, say, run for higher office, oh, it's that guy, right? He was the guy who was working on that highway issue with us, right? I mean, those sorts of things, I think you slowly build up, and you just can't, you're never going to get it at the national level within the constraints of the two-party system until I think you build up from the bottom that way, unless you have a big name person at the top of the ticket. I mean, if Justin Amash decides that's what he's going to do in 2024, immediately you have media coverage you would, more so than Gary got, I think, immediately get media coverage that you wouldn't get otherwise. So that's, again, that's one possible strategy at the top of the ticket, but I certainly think building up from the bottom makes more sense especially in terms of media coverage.
Our next question is going to be coming from Jake. I'll go ahead and ask you to unmute and lower that hand. Go ahead, Jake.
All right, thank you very much. So based on a lot of the topics we talked about today, as far as the empathy side of things, I've got a lot of left-leaning friends, some downright communist. And for me, what I found is, talking about points that matter to them, civil rights issues, police reforms, things like that, we're right on the same page. Boom, boom, boom. Yes, 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 agree. And then brick walls just pop up. Things like capitalism. Of course, I'm not really trying to pull in people who are already communists. They may be a lost cause, although it's good for banter. But, people who maybe are just a little more sympathetic to that, things like capitalism, things like gun rights, for example, seem to just put up a brick wall in the conversation, and there's no getting through it. Whereas, some of my friends on the right, we have conversations, they seem a little more sympathetic or actually apathetic is the word, when you get to maybe they don't care about civil rights issues or gender issues, but when you get to that point from a government perspective, they don't care. Do you have any thoughts or strategies for people from the left who do agree on the empathy points we talked about today? Any thoughts or strategies on how to get them over those hurdles as far as things like economic theory or gun rights or things along those lines?
I think people have the beliefs that they do about capitalism, I think, because of their understanding of history. And they have a set of historical beliefs about the Industrial Revolution, a set of beliefs about the sort of progressive era and monopolies, a set of beliefs about the Great Depression, all of which sort of say, hey, this is the capitalism has failed. Notice, by the way, right, that capitalism keeps failing even though we keep trying to fix it and intervene in it, right? It failed and then we intervened and capitalism failed again, right? So I think part of the response is to sort of say, well, let's, why do you think that way? What makes you believe that capitalism is bad on those grounds, okay? And try to focus in on what the issue is, and then maybe that's a way into the conversation. I think being able to, one thing I've had a lot more luck with recently is this sort of stuff about how capitalism and markets have improved people's living standards, even in the last 50 years, but certainly in the last 100 or 200 years, right? And if you watch that washing machine video, Hans Rosling, by the way, is a leftist. He passed away a couple years ago. He was a leftist. But that's like the most persuasive 9 minutes about, capitalism ever. And so I think sort of talking in those terms and sort of emphasizing, let's look at the record. I mean, this is Rosling, and this is to some degree Steve Pinker and these other people saying, let's look at what actually liberalism has accomplished, capitalism has accomplished. Oftentimes, by the way, the problem with capitalism is a disagreement over what that word means. And I think that can be a source, particularly among more academic intellectual types, right? They often think capitalism means anything that's in the interest of capital. And then I think we got to talk about crony capitalism. We got to talk about rent seeking and all that kind of stuff. Say, no, right? You're okay with, are you okay with Bill Gates or with Steve Jobs or with Jeff Bezos? Are you a guillotine person? Those are the ones we can't really probably convince, right? But are you okay with them because we made them rich, right? We did that, and we're better off for it. And I think sort of remembering that, right, that how much the critics themselves, as they type out their anti-capitalist screeds on their Macs and their iPads and everything else, right, have sort of are part of why those folks are so rich. Sort of remembering that's a value for value proposition. Remembering too that innovators, keep only 2% of the value they create. The rest goes to us as consumers. So sort of talking that way, right, and not making it a defense of those guys' property, right? He should have the right to keep whatever he. No, how has they've done? What real capitalists do improve the lives of others? I think that's, and there's always what's the alternative question, right? Which is then there's a whole other conversation to be had. I think another strategy, by the way, with folks on the left with economics is that, we understand how markets and capitalism are spontaneous, unplanned orders, right? They're results of human action and not human design, just like Darwinian evolution. Right. And so drawing that analogy, you have to be a little careful because you're not doing social Darwinism, right? You're saying, but analogy, you already believe it's possible for there to be these orderly structures in the world that no one designed and that no one planned, right? That's how markets work. That's how economies work. Let's look at them that way, right? And you if you want to be a little more glib with them, and if you do it with a smile on your face, you're the equivalent of an economic creationist, right? If you think you can intervene and make this thing go in ways that you want it to go. So I think there's some strategies there, right, that get them to think in a way they haven't thought before. I mean, that's how I think about it with my students. I'm not going to make them into libertarians. I'm not sure I want to, but in one sitting. But if they now see the world in a different way than they did before, then we're on the road.
All right, guys, we've got two more questions, one from Laura and then one from Marshall. And then we're going to go ahead and end the recording, move into kind of the more social conversations. Laura, go ahead.
Thank you. My question is related to building or bridging trust. So we live in Tampa Bay, if you will, broken down to Pinellas County and Hillsborough County. And within Hillsborough County, there is a local county commissioner who actually just went to the Florida Supreme Court, and there was a transportation tax that was ruled unconstitutional. How can we have this, leverage this opportunity as a party of the Tampa Bay, if you will? And what would that look like? What are your thoughts on that?
So let me be clear on the question. So how do you get in on that action? Is that
correct? How do we capitalize on this opportunity that's presented in Tampa Bay to outwardly face, to carry our message, and to grow our party?
Yeah, I think you got to look for opportunities where the LP can sort of release statements of support to the media for local things and state level things that we like and would support, right? Will you get coverage? I don't know. But again, as Brett said, if you have connections with local reporters, right, this is where you use them. And you say, if it's a county level issue, you say the Pinellas County LP supports this, whatever, or is opposed to this bill or this particular move. And I think you just do that, and you release a statement to the media, and you send it to people who and go from there. I do think the media can be attracted to stories where the LP jumps in on an issue that's a hot issue locally or statewide, right? and takes a position and indicates support or opposition, it makes it a more interesting story. I think particularly when the LP's on the side of the Democrats, right? That's more unexpected and therefore more interesting. But even not, I think those are important things, right? And especially if you can stress that the LP has been involved in an issue for a number of years, or has been concerned about this for a while, or has a slightly different take on it, to sort of say we support this bill, but here's some additional things that we would point to, and trying to elbow your way into that conversation, and you got to be interesting, right? I mean, so analogy from my world, there's a lot of really smart economists who you would never want to put in front of a TV camera, right? Because they're just a disaster. Okay, I'm not one of those, I don't think. And as a result, when I do stuff on local TV, they want me back, okay, because I'm a good interview. And I think, that's having a spokesperson who's a good interview. Nick's great. And so, when he was doing that work, it was great. So having a spokesperson and having leaders who are good in front of a camera or good on the radio is important, right? And it's both, you don't want to be dull, you want to be interesting, but you also have to be precise and careful in how you say things, so you don't walk into traps. And that, if you're good, you'll build trust, right? And so just a little story. I totally accidentally got into this whole thing every fall now about Christmas, about holiday shopping and the impact of holiday shopping. And this year it included why there won't be Santas at malls and sort of, all this consumer stuff. And it's not really like something I do research deep on, but I knew a little bit about it. And my media guy at Ball State got some local media. And so I did 4, 5, 6 different TV hits this fall about this stuff. And they keep coming back to me because, again, I'm a good interview and I'm clear and I'm energetic and all these sorts of things. And so suddenly now you've got a place. And they will. And so when Indiana got the NCAA tournament, right, I got a couple calls from media, from newspapers to sort of comment on it. I don't know shit about that per se. In fact, one called me the other day, asked me for my thoughts on the news of that morning about the tournament. And I said, well, you're going to have to give me a minute because I haven't looked at the Indy Star today, what's going on. So even before but that's how you build trust, right? Is that you're good and you're clear and you're effective and you're interesting, and you pick the right balance.
Thank you. And our last question is going to be from Marshall. Marshall, go ahead and unmute and I'll lower the hand and ask Professor Horwitz your question.
Thank you. My question is, why don't libertarian economists such as yourself speak of inequality really starting in this country about 50 years ago, when the last link to gold was cut? It seems to me it is not a coincidence that Federal Reserve monetary policy like that has been able to be taken advantage of by people who know how to use it. Thank you.
There was just, I want to say this week, in the last few days, I believe maybe even yesterday or Thursday, there was an online seminar at Cato, and the title was something like Wealth and Inequality and Fed Policy or something like that. Again, I saw it in passing. I know there's been some papers coming out recently about this. So I do think that folks are beginning to explore the linkage between Fed policy and inequality. I think the ones I've seen have been sort of more recent, not going back to 71 and the closing of the gold window. But I think, as you say, I think there's a potential story there about the ways in which expansionary Fed policy has benefited, as you say, benefited those who have access to power and know how to manipulate that system and are on the inside of it. Absolutely the case, for example, right now, that the increase in asset prices as a result of expansionary policy, and that increase in asset prices is most certainly benefiting those who already have assets, right, as opposed to those who don't. So I think it's a legit concern. I think it's one that that economists, libertarian economists, maybe aren't talking about as much as they should, but are certainly looking at in the last few years.
All right, Professor Horwitz, thank you so much. I appreciate everybody who showed up on this Saturday morning for our very first coffee talk. Want to remind everybody who is here and may watch this later, on April the 10th at 9 a.m. we will be hosting our second of this series with Nicholas Sarwark, the former LNC chair. He's a part of the conversation today, as you've seen. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording now, and I am going to open things up to a less formal discussion.